This lecture is on Chapter 3, Multicultural Counseling Competence for Counselors and Therapists of Marginalized Groups. This section and chapter looks at the necessary competence and challenges relevant to counselors that are in the minority group or of marginalized groups. I think it's important to stop right here and just before we jump into this, let's look at page 76. And it's important for us to look at this chapter because, as it clearly describes on page 76, the majority of counselors in our field are white. If you look around at your classes, you'll see that the majority of your classmates are from the majority group, and they are white. And the theories and practices that you are taught are developed and come from this white or Western-centric perspective. Going a little bit further, white straight males hold the majority of power in policies and procedures and they just hold the majority of the power. So here we have this predominantly white field, a predominantly white way of theorizing and practicing with clients, and then of course the power that sort of is the deciding factors is being held from predominantly white straight males. So you can see that there's this clear power differential, and I'm wondering, consider your perspective and consider your group. If you're a majority group member, let's say you're a white straight male, how did it feel to hear this? How did it feel to sort of read this in your textbook? If you're a minority group member, how did it feel for you to hear this and read this in your textbook? That ownership of this sort of power differential is admitted and written down, and we're discussing it. And that there are some clear challenges and hurdles associated with being a member of a profession in a majority-controlled sort of field. I'm wondering how that feels for you, and just sort of take a moment to think about that. You are all being educated in programs, predominantly, that are from this white-centric perspective and these white-centric approaches. And I'm wondering how you feel about that. I think that's important for you to reflect upon. But it's important also to know that, being in a minority group or a counselor of color does not automatically mean that you are culturally competent. And as a matter of fact, as this chapter goes into a great detail, there can be some additional challenges that you may experience or you may feel or you may encounter because you are in the field that is, the majority of the counselors are sort of white and from this white-centric perspective. But it doesn't automatically mean that you are culturally competent. Your level of oppression does not equate to your level of expertise. Your level of experience is incredibly important in your work with your clients and building rapport. But again, that's very different than equating that to your level of expertise. And so going off of that, when we sort of turn to page 77, the authors go into the idea of racial identity development. And I'm going to post an article, it's Helms, Racial Identity Development Model. And this is kind of a fundamental piece that I think you need to read for our profession. It goes into sort of the stages that exist in our process of developing our racial identity. And of course, this process can be fractured and oftentimes is fractured. And so this identity development isn't necessarily always as linear or healthy as necessary, but essentially it's the stages that exist in an individual that ranges from sort of conformity to racial and ethnic heritage to identifying as you wish and appreciating and understanding cultural differences, even dominant culture. So if you're going through this racial identity development in a way that is healthy and appropriate, again, I'll give you that article, then at some point in your exploration, there's the opportunity for you to sort of understand others' perspectives, even those oppressive perspectives, even those perspectives of the dominant culture. Doesn't mean you have to agree or like or even sort of but that you understand, you appreciate it, and that you are comfortable and identify with your perspective. It's really important. That doesn't just apply to racial identity development. That's gender, that's ethnicity, that's social class. The idea of sexual orientation and gender fluidity and things, and gender not just being binary, male or female. That's a thing that a lot of folks struggle with, particularly folks who are a little bit older and maybe don't understand this philosophy. And if we're looking at racial identity development model, they're sort of stuck in the idea of identifying and understanding their own racial identity, but accepting that piece about accepting others and understanding others. That might be an area of stagnation. So look into racial identity development and read the Helms article that I'm going to post for you. But that's something that I really wanted to take some time and discuss in this chapter. Another thing that I want to point out is there is this level of mistrust and misunderstanding and envy among all group members. So it's not just a one-way street. It's not just mistrust and misunderstanding against dominant culture and all minority cultures. It's not just a misunderstanding between majority white culture and African American cultures. And your book goes into a great detail at looking at the various ways that misunderstanding, mistrust, myths, falsities about other cultures can be perpetuated, and that we kind of are all guilty of potentially doing this at various times. If you look at page 71, there's some data how we can misunderstand each other, and that goes in a variety of different directions. So, for instance, it's not just this majority group against minority groups, or maybe majority white group against African American group members. That it goes a variety of different ways, a variety of different directions. And that can be pretty scary. Some of this data that's listed in the book, I need to point out, is outdated. You can see that some of these resources are 1994, 2008, and as I was sort of writing this down as something that I wanted to talk to you guys about, I wonder what you think this data would look like right now. Our current culture and our current climate is volatile, and that's probably the nicest way that I could say it. And I wonder what you think this information and divisiveness among cultures and ethnic groups and racial groups might look like now. Think about that for a second. What do you think this data would look like? Do you think it would be worse, or do you think it would be better? I personally think it might be a little worse. I think that the divisiveness that is very, very palpable in our community and our culture right now might make these numbers look a little more grim. Your book goes into sort of these specific relationships between other group members and how minority group members can also perpetuate sort of conflict and bias and prejudice. And I'm supposed to be going through these slides, and here we are, so that you can all, I've caught up. So again, just as your level of oppression, just as your membership in a minority group doesn't equate to cultural competence, it also doesn't equate to the idea that you are free of bias and discrimination. Being in a minority group, you can be biased or prejudiced against other minority group members. And again, your book goes into some great detail about this. I think when we relate this to client work, it's important for us to know that regardless of the majority or minority group that you are in, the different groups have different views of how therapy is supposed to look and happen. And so it's your responsibility to look at, is this group member from more of a collectivist culture or an individual or autonomous culture? Do they value the idea of sharing personal, deep, private information with you and potentially others, or is this is an issue that I need to fix on my own? And the way that you work with them is certainly going to change based off of that perspective. And then within groups, so going even further, within groups, values may be the same. Marginalized group values or minority group values may be similar or be the same, but the way it's expressed may be very different. So this is important in your work with others, because while you may have the same value system as your client, the way that that value is expressed or displayed or communicated about and around may be very different. So again, these assumptions that things happen linear, we have to sort of put those aside. And of course, that's within, this section talks about your challenges of being a minority group member counselor, but also, making sure that if you're of the majority group, this particularly applies to you. And then I want to just kind of jump down the last few seconds. I want to talk about these situations. So the challenges associated with being a counselor of color or in a minority group and working with white clients. And I think this is a pretty interesting section here. And there's a table 3.1. It's on page 88, and it talks about these. And so, challenging the competency of counselors of color. So the challenge could be that if you happen to have a majority group member client, if you have a white client, the situation could exist that maybe just based off the fact that you're a minority group member or a counselor of color, that the perception could be that you aren't as well informed or well educated. Moving on, there could be a need to sort of overstate or over-present your competence to make up for the idea or the belief that maybe you have to prove your competence because of this sort of myth that maybe there's a lack of education or a lack of your credibility. Transferring racial animosity. So this is a clear example of transference. Are you taking out your animosity against majority group members on your white clients? Is this happening? Are you aware that there's a possibility that this could happen? Going to situation 4, so viewing the counselor of color as a super minority counselor. So on the flip side of that, feeling as a white client, feeling overly, your white client feeling sort of overly connected or wanting to be your client and just sort of hanging on every word that you say, regardless of exploration, because you do have this, they say super minority counselor, this superpower, because you have this experience of being, or not experience, your position of being a minority counselor. And then situation 5, dealing with clients' expression of racism. You are going to encounter clients who are racist and who say things that are pretty ignorant. And this may be intentional, this may be unintentional, and that's certainly a challenge. And then we'll go into challenges of clients in or counselors in a minority group counseling clients in a minority group. Over-identification. So like, I feel you, I'm there with you, you and I have the same experience. That's certainly a challenge. Encountering clashes in cultural values. Experiencing clashes in communication. Are you talking to them in a way that they can hear you? That animosity thing is back up. And then last but not police, dealing with racial identity, so that exploration.